So our next speaker is Mr. Bernard Gloster, who is the CEO of Tusla, the Child and Family Agency. He's former Chief Officer for HSE Midwest, and he has 30 years experience as a social care practitioner and social health service manager. So I'm sure we're all eager to hear from Bernard. So I'll pass you on now. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire and Sarah, and thanks for hosting this morning. And hello to everybody on the call. What strange times we find ourselves in adapting to coming together in this way. Just perhaps 9 months ago, the choice of technology and webinar was perhaps a convenient choice, and we could take it or leave it, and we could mix it with coming together. But now it is thankfully available to us because it is the only choice for now as we deal with the global pandemic and all that that will bring. Very conscious today that as you talk about one child, that the impact indeed of the unintended consequences of responding to the pandemic has presented many challenges for children, and for children universally, not just those in the child protection system and not just those in the disability system, but universally. And I think it's important that when we talk about one child and we talk about our messaging to them, that we keep that in focus too. I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to talk to you as the CEO of the Child and Family Agency, and as Claire said, I've been in that position for the last year. Before that, I was a chief officer managing all of the non-acute hospital services of the HSE in the Midwest, and that of course included disability services, mental health services, services for older people, social inclusion services, and so on. And so I come from many different perspectives and many different organisational perspectives of the types of challenges that you've chosen as a subject matter to talk about today. And you deserve great recognition for doing that, and I think particularly in the context of talking about children who require, need and use other services, and also who are part of or the focus of attention of the disability services. And in that context, you are talking about integrated working. The speakers this morning, I think, have given you a lot of different flavour of the types of issues and approaches to a whole range of challenges that we are presented with as public service providers when it comes to providing services to children. The Ombudsman and his seminal work, not just in the publication of the report that has become known as the Molly case, but indeed his follow-up of that. And one of the first things that arrived on my desk when I arrived into the Child and Family Agency as CEO was a request for an update as to what the agency had or had not done, as the case was, in relation to implementing the recommendations of the Molly report. And I looked at it and thought to myself, I remember doing that in the HSE, so that perhaps crystallised me my experiential understanding of the range of issues and challenges that can be presented. Nobody could be, I think, but blown away this morning by the presentation by Catherine and her experience in relation to her life as a parent and their life as a family, and the stories of Dermot and Julie. And I think the point about hope was particularly important. Point. I think it has a significance beyond the hope of a parent. I think all of us as people who aspire to provide or lead or manage or deliver professional services, regardless of our role within those, if with the evidence and with the practice and with the skill set we don't articulate, show and demonstrate a sense of hope for the future, for people who find themselves in vulnerable situations. Well, what hope do they have if we're not part of sharing that journey and creating that hope for them? And the outcomes for Dermot and Julie, as you saw this morning, they weren't by accident. They were the outcomes of a determined and very focused family in doing what is, as Catherine called it, inclusion, and ensuring inclusion and ensuring fulfillment of potential. So as I talked to you today, then I wondered what perhaps reflections I could give you over the space of a short piece, such as this morning. And I'm conscious I'm talking to you as a group of social work professionals, and of course there are many other disciplines who have an active interest in this subject matter. And I guess one of the things I wanted to reflect on for a couple of minutes is systems and structures. And why do I want to do that? Well, I want to do it because you will see that very quickly it will lead me on to a place of talking about what I believe is being attempted, needs to continue to be attempted, and to use Niall Muldoon's phrase, needs to be not cast in perfection, but cast in continuous improvement. And that I'm talking about is integration. I come from a background where I can remember the structures of Ireland's health and personal social services going back quite a significant period of time, over 30 years. And even if you go back a little bit before my time into what were the former health boards in Ireland, I can recall a system where life appeared simple, structures appeared simple, so structures appeared easy to understand. That's not to say they always achieved everything they wanted to achieve, or indeed, it's not to say that they should have stayed the way they were. But there was a time in Ireland when the health board system had three simple parts to it. It had the local regional hospital, which was the acute hospital. It had the special hospitals, which were the elderly care and the mental health institutions as they were then. And it had community care, which was essentially the local area medical officer, the public health nurse, the community welfare officer, and latterly, but sometime latterly, the social worker. You'd be hard pressed in the 1980s in the health service to find a physiotherapist outside of a hospital or a special hospital. And now there are an explosion of all allied health professionals and social work services right across a whole range of community services. And that shows how services have changed and how evidence has changed and how styles and classes of intervention have changed. I was listening to Jude there from the Lindara service, and I can recall as a young health service employee in the Midwest, I can recall there never being a CAMS service, and I can recall the very first CAMS consultant being appointed there. Now I think when I left there, I think there are 6, if not 7, all with multidisciplinary teams around them, and those are really good advances. And but the point about structures was very quickly after those 3 programs, what happened was we developed in Ireland's system what we call a care group model. And so we have a disability care group, we have a mental health care group, we have a primary care group, we have a social inclusion care group, and we had a children and families care group. And those are really good things because they brought about them very specific focus on those specific needs. They brought about advocacy, they brought about new legislation, they brought about regulations, and they brought about many different things. But the reason I want to talk about structures, and I want to talk about those care group structures, is they also brought and bring their own challenges. And that's not to say they shouldn't happen. Structures are important. They're important for governance and other things. But they did bring many challenges. And one of the greatest challenges, I believe, that structures bring is the challenge of integration. If I could ask you to cast your minds back just to 2014, when the Child and Family Agency was established, it was established as an extraction from the HSE on the belief and on the basis that establishing a dedicated, single and focused agency on the care group of children and families would bring about a resolution to all of what were seen to be the many problems, challenges, and indeed scandals that characterised the discourse on child protection services over particularly the latter part of the 1990s and into the noughties. And there is no doubt that the establishment of the agency did allow for and bring a very welcome focus, and perhaps its greatest achievement was to take that fear that child protection and welfare services would be lost in this melee of a health system that increasingly became focused on a hospital-centric model, because that's what people focused on. That's what the public focused on. And so it did bring a benefit, but did it bring many challenges? Yes, it did. Did it resolve things? Yes, it did. But it brought even greater integration challenges. And so let me give you two reflections on that. As part of one of my many roles as a senior manager in the health services before Tusla was established, I managed and line managed the different care groups. So the disability manager in Limerick, the child and family manager in Limerick, the mental health manager in Limerick, the older persons manager in Limerick, they all reported or pointed into my office. Were there challenges and disputes about cases then? Were there challenges and disputes about who owned the case, who was the lead, who took the most responsibility, who provided indeed the resource if resource was required? All of those debates happened within the one organisation, but between the different parts of the structure of that organisation. And those same debates happened in the case of Molly, and those same debates happened between what is now the HSE and the Child and Family Agency. So with our structures and with the importance of structures comes that challenge of integration. And so what I would say is that the care group system, regardless of which group we are talking about or which need we are talking about, we could say the exact same in relation to CAMS, or indeed adults with mental health services, or indeed older people with chronic disease. As we develop expertise in each individual subject matter and care group, and as we subspecialise and subspecialise further, and you guys work in the disability services and you know that there was one time occupational therapists. There are now occupational therapists who specialise in disability, and there are indeed occupational therapists who specialise in subsets of disability. And rightly so. Expertise science is a really good thing. But it's because we develop those structures, those systems, and those specialities that we all have to be mindful, and we have to be challenged every day by reaching that higher bar, and very often what appears to be the elusive integration. And if we pursue integration, well, what does that mean in practical terms? I think there are a lot of different things we could say about it. And writing in the Irish health context, I know that one particular author looking at the health service, and when I say health service, I mean all of the social care services as well. But in writing about integration in the context of the Irish health service, this particular writer, Darker is her name, was able to identify in the international literature 175 different definitions of integration, because everyone has a view on it, everyone has a perspective, everyone has a take. And why? Because it is of itself not an exact science. It is as much an aspiration, it is a way of working, it's a belief system, it's a value, it's a culture, as well as methodology. And yet, when all was said and done in those 175 definitions, I guess it boils down to the World Health Organization and other definitions, but it really boils down to two things for me. Integration, true integration in services, whether they are personal social services, whether they're health services, whether they're alternative care services, whether they're education services, whether they're justice services, whether they're equality services. But in any service that a person interacts with, needs, uses, wants, has to have, Integration is when people get what they need, when they need it, and for the right outcome. That ultimately captures what integration is, and therefore should be the challenge to all of us. And the second thing I would say about integration is integration isn't of itself an end. It's not an object. It's not an objective that I should think I will get my organization by 5 steps to. Integration is a means. It's a means. It's a means of understanding, and it's a means of working. And so if I take you back very briefly to the care groups that we talked about, really good, seminal, hard work done in those care groups, and should continue to be. But when I take you back to them, and I take you to the 2 care groups that I guess we're talking about really in the context of what I'm saying to you today, which is children and family services and disability services. There are children who are in the child protection, welfare and family support space who do not have a disability. There are children who have a disability who are not in the child protection, welfare and family support space. One might think that that's pretty straightforward. Well, it's not straightforward, because there still is within the child and family agency, as indeed within the health service, there's a requirement for integration within the different parts of those organisations to make sure the outcome is effective. However, when a child is in both the disability and the child protection, welfare or family support space, when they are together, the challenge of integration is very high. That's what Molly was about. That's what Molly is about. And indeed, the Ombudsman perhaps would reflect to you, Molly's an index case of that, or an indicator. There are others. And so the challenge of integration is so high. And perhaps, apart from all of the protocols, and we do have some very good and advanced protocols, I think we have made improvements this year. But it's not my job to blow trumpet about what those improvements are. I think we have removed, for example, when a child with a disability, also with a child welfare issue, when a child is the subject of the joint protocol, we have now just probably in this week about to be signed off, but we have now arrived at an agreement where if that child has to come into an alternative care system, be it a disability specialist placement or a child protection placement, but where both agencies are justifiably involved because of the protocol, we have now taken away from the professionals the need to argue about who pays or who doesn't pay. And that's a very significant step forward. Ironically, where the child doesn't have to come into care is probably where still some of the greatest challenges are, because children at perhaps with mild disability, but who still nonetheless need services, those services are in the primary care space. And I think everybody knows that those services are very challenged. They're exceptionally challenged in terms of waiting lists. And so I believe part of the answer of that, of course, is positive discrimination in favour of the most needy at times. But whatever the reference points are, whether it's disability, child protection, or both, and Conor mentioned earlier the legal framework, and I find when I read cases that the agency is involved in before the President of the High Court, I certainly find that we're in danger as public service organisations of presenting too many problems and not enough solutions, because of the boundaries that are drawn, either because of the legislation that gives us our function, the resource that gives us what we do, or the organisation setup that we have. And we can easily, in that context, lose sight of the fact that children don't live in care groups. Children don't live in agencies. Children are children, and children live lives. And when that life has a need, or when that potential in that life is challenged, if not indeed threatened, then the type of service and support system that's required for that is one that is truly integrated, so that it doesn't matter to the child or the family, whether that's the HSE or whether that's Tusla or indeed whether that's the Department of Education. And that's what real integration is, and that's what we have to pursue. And that's why I think your point of focus today on one child explores many of those challenges, none of which come with easy answers. But the answers do and will become easier if our disposition, if all of our disposition as public services, if all of it is about focusing, is about focused on integration. So when I look here, I see, what is Tusla's position when children are abandoned in hospitals because of stress and inability to continue managing at home? Okay, well, as somebody who managed hospital services in the past and now in the position that I'm in, um, I think it's very regrettable that situations emerge where children are in hospital for prolonged periods of time when they don't have a medical requirement to be there. So that's the first thing. I think that's exceptionally regrettable. The second thing I would say is if, as I assume in the question, and I am perhaps making an assumption, if there's a prevalence of significant level of disability and or indeed adolescent mental health issues within it, that's where the integrated requirement comes in. Because that should not be a case where the disability services alone should be expected to or should find the solution, or the child and family agency alone, or indeed the CAM services, depending on the case. It should be the case that it is a collective response with a collective solution and a collective focus. And there will be times when the disability dimension that's driving the care will suggest that the disability service is a natural lead. And there will indeed be times when the care and protection and welfare side suggests that the Tusla service should be the lead. But one being the lead doesn't obviate the other of their responsibility. Children are considered safe in an acute hospital, and the experience on the ground is that Tusla feel it's a disability services issue, and disability services feel it's a Tusla issue. I think that's what I've just said. As you say, true integration means that we have to somehow overcome the structural and budgetary barriers. Yes, we do. But they're not just structural and budgetary barriers. I firmly believe they are also within our own disposition as professionals. And why do I say that? What's my evidence for saying that? Well, like I said, before there was ever a child and family agency, I managed a health service where it was quite common for two different care groups to argue over actually whose case is it. And while that is driven by statutory responsibility, budgets and history and other things, it means we're not starting from the right place. We're not starting from the place. Here is a child, and this child has a requirement. I've rarely encountered children or indeed older people who have chronic disease. It's ironic, there's some of the similarities in both care groups. I've rarely encountered a child who requires intervention and support of public services but only requires one discipline or one part of the system. Rarely have I encountered that, and that's why integration is so important. What are your thoughts on children going into full-time residential placement through the disability service and who then in effect don't have the statutory protections that Tusla children's day care have? Yeah, well, that question is one that's often asked of me, and indeed the Ombudsman I know raised it in a case not yet published. What would I say to you about it? Well, the first thing I would say is the children who come into placement in disability services have at least the possibility of much more protection in the regulatory space than they did have heretofore, because under the Health Act 2007, leading to the disability placement of children in residential centres for disabilities 2013, there is quite a good regulatory standard and context there. Even if it's not being achieved, the oversight is there. One thing I would say, and I have argued this with the Ombudsman in a discussion recently, as I have done with my colleagues in the HSE, children coming into state care in the context of what we understand state care to be in terms of Tusla, the Child and Family Agency, or the legislative framework that Conor talked about. Children coming into state care are coming predominantly because that link between Section 3 and the other parts of the Act, adequate care and protection where they are, and indeed, in many cases, unfortunately, being abused, mistreated, or neglected. I do not believe uh, that children who have a disability, who are in loving, caring homes with families who do nothing other than give of their all to care for and support them. I do not believe in that context that when the level of care for the disability becomes so high that the default position should be the child protection legislation. In other words, I don't believe we should be funneling children into something for which it wasn't designed. I'm very satisfied there's adequate provisions in the Health Act and in the subsequent regulations to provide those services. But I equally would say where both cross over each other, well, the integration is the critical piece. Last question. With the review of the Childcare Act, I'd be interested to know what your view is on the use of voluntary admissions to care being so varied across the country, but for children with disability in long-term care, and of course all children in long-term care, do you feel it's appropriate to children's permanency planning that they remain in care on voluntary consent? Wow. Well, that is a debate that's quite significant at the moment. There's a lot of recent research, particularly Conor O'Mahony, who happens to also be the Special Rapporteur on children around voluntary consent. Um, I'm not going to make the distinction between disability and indeed child protection in responding to that. What I would say to you is voluntary consent to alternative care has always been a really important feature of the relationship between the state and families, uh, because it creates a space where there can be full agreement about the need for care at a point in time and the shared understanding of it. However, in the context of the modern day world we've moved on to, and levels of regulation, oversight, scrutiny, and indeed learnings from when things go wrong, I would say without fear of contradiction that voluntary care needs a lot more checks and balances to make sure it's not something that drifts, or indeed that it's never used inappropriately. And as you rightly say, significant questions arise in the context of permanency planning. So I think that's all the questions, I think. Okay, thank you.